Okay, so I need to talk about the Silk Road, and I need you to forget everything the phrase trade route makes you picture, because I promise you it's not that. It's not a highway, it's not a supply chain, it's not some tidy line on a map with an arrow that says goods go this way. Here's the thing that broke my brain a little. The Silk Road wasn't a road. There wasn't a sign anywhere. There wasn't even really a single Silk Road. The name got slapped on it in the 1870s by a German geographer centuries after the fact. Because Europeans love naming things even if it doesn't belong to them. The people actually walking it never called it that. To them, it was just the way you got somewhere. A tangle of trails, some barely trails at all, stretching from the Pacific coast of China all the way to the Mediterranean, splitting and merging and rerouting depending on weather, war, and whichever warlord currently felt like taxing you. It was thousands of miles of desert that will kill you if you got cocky, mountain passes that kill you if you sneeze wrong, oases that show up like plot twists, monasteries carved directly into cliff faces like someone dared a monk to commit to the bit, and cities full of people who don't speak each other's languages but somehow still ran a functioning centuries long international economy together with no common currency or government backing any of it. See, a merchant could leave China with a cart of silk and come back years later having met Buddhist monks, Persian astronomers, guys carrying ancient Roman coins that somehow drifted 5,000 miles from where they were minted, horse archers, sacred relics nobody back home had a name for, and stories about animals and cities so wild that his own neighbors probably assumed he was lying through his teeth and needed to go to the asylum, if you know what I mean. And the thing is I keep having the same thought over and over. This sounds like a fantasy novel. Like, this is the setup. This is the map at the front of the book. You know, the one with little compass rose and the sea monster doodled in the corner. Except it happened. Reality. Like, in reality, for centuries. No wizard required. So now I'm wondering if I've had it backwards this whole time. What if fantasy doesn't imitate imagination as much as we think? What if it's imitating history? Like, what if the history has always been the weirder, more unbelievable one, and fantasy is just catching up slowly, several thousand years behind? And I'm going to sit with that idea for a while because I think it's the whole engine of this episode. So let's actually take it apart. So let's get physical for a second because I think the road framing does this whole thing a disservice before we even start. Picture the actual terrain. You've got the Taklamakan Desert, which translates, depending on who you ask, to something like you go in, you don't come out. That's not a metaphor. That's just what the locals called it. Then you got the Pamir Mountains, nicknamed the roof of the world, where the air is thin enough that pack animals just drop. You have the Gobi. You have river crossings that only work certain months of the year. You have zero GPS, obviously, zero weather forecasting, and your entire survival hinges on oral tradition and knowledge passed between strangers about which well still has water in it this season. Now, here's the detail that actually gets me. None of this worked without infrastructure. Like, we think of the Silk Road as this organic wandering thing, and culturally, yeah, okay, it was. But physically, somebody had to build it. Caravanserais, the big fortified rest stop inns, were spaced out at roughly a day's travel apart. Think about that. That's not a coincidence. It's design. Like, some ruler, some empire, or local governor looked at a map and said, people need to stop and sleep exactly here, or they die in the gap. And then built a building to solve that specific problem. Like, think about what that means. Like, somewhere there was a person whose entire job was estimating how far a tired camel could realistically walk in a day, and then commissioning a wall to go up at that exact point. That's not glamorous. Nobody's gonna write an epic poem about the caravanserai spacing guy. But without him, there's no Silk Road. There's just a desert that eats travelers. And I love this because it's such an unsexy, invisible piece of infrastructure holding up one of the most romanticized things in human history. It's the load-bearing wall nobody photographs. And once you start looking for it, you realize almost every mythic has that unsexy structural skeleton underneath. Every legend has a logistics department. Somebody in Rome is doing math about how many amphora of wine fit on a ship. Someone in a fantasy kingdom is figuring out how the royal messengers actually get fed. We tend to skip straight to the myth and never ask who keeps the supply lines running, and I think that's a mistake, creatively and historically. See, the myth is the tip of an iceberg made entirely of someone's incredibly boring spreadsheet. So think about it. Imagine a person who designed the invisible system nobody thinks. That's a character worth writing about. Like, that's a whole story right there. The engineer of wonder, the guy whose legacy is a well-placed wall where 1,000 other people's legends happen. Pretty cool thought. Okay. So, settings exist. Terrains exist. Infrastructures exist. Now, the real question, why? Why would a human being with a perfectly good home and perfectly good odds of staying alive by not doing this choose to walk into the Taklamakan? Survival doesn't get you here. Nobody dies for the vibes. So, what's actually driving this? Well, what's driving everything else in the world? Money, obviously. Because at the time, silk was worth its weight in gold in Rome. Literally. Like, there are Roman writers complaining that silk was bankrupting the empire because rich people wouldn't stop buying it. But money alone doesn't explain the monks. It doesn't explain the guy walking to India for 17 years just to bring back better copies of Buddhist scripture because he thought the versions of China in China had been mistranslated. That's an actual person, by the way, like documented. A monk named Shuzang, could be saying that wrong, apologize, 7th century, walked from China through Central Asia into India and back, mostly alone, mostly on foot, because he had a hunch that the sacred texts he'd grown up with had been garbled somewhere along the way, and he wanted the real thing. He nearly died of thirst in the desert at one point, but kept going anyway. Like, sit with that for a bit. A guy risked his life repeatedly over the accuracy of a translation. Like, not a kingdom, not gold, a translation. That's either the most impractical decision in human history or one of the most romantic. I mean, it could be a bit of both, actually, if we're being honest. So now I've got at least 3 different engines running simultaneously on the same stretch of road. Greed, faith, and curiosity. And I don't think those 3 motivations trusted each other very much. I mean, the merchant thinks the monk is wasting his life. The monk probably thinks the merchant is missing the point of existence. And yet, they share the same caravan, the same well, the same caravanserai roof at night. Because the desert doesn't care about your motivations. It only cares whether you have water. And that's such a good, uncomfortable detail. Like, the Silk Road forced radically different value systems in physical proximity to each other, with no way to avoid each other. Think about that. Like, you can't unfollow the guy snoring next to you in a caravanserai because his goals don't align with yours. You're stuck. You're going to talk to him. You're going to learn his language a little, or he'll learn yours out of boredom and self-preservation. And honestly, if you think about it, that's such a rare condition now. Like, we built a whole modern world specifically engineered to let us avoid people who don't share our motivations. Algorithms sort us into little value-aligned bubbles. The Silk Road physically could not do that. The desert doesn't have a For You page. I mean, it has one well, and everyone's standing around it, whether they liked each other's god or not. Now imagine it. Trust on the Silk Road wasn't a nice to have. It was structural. Like, you couldn't survive this network alone. Every single traveler at some point was entirely dependent on a stranger who owed them nothing. For water, for directions, for a place to sleep, for not being murdered in the night. Multiply that by centuries and thousands of travelers, and you have this staggering, largely unrecorded mountain of human trust. Transaction after transaction that nobody writes history books about because guy shared his tea with another guy and neither of them died doesn't really sound like history. But it is history. It's actually most of it, if you think about it. And I don't want to sugarcoat this, because it matters, and skipping it would make the whole thing feel like a theme park version of itself. The Silk Road moved beautiful things. It also moved slaves. It also moved diseases, and moved conquest and forced conversion and violence that eradicated entire communities. Some of the same roads that carried Buddhist scripture also carried invading armies who burned the monasteries down a century later. And some of the same caravanserais that hosted merchants sharing recipes also historically functioned as nodes in slave trading networks. Like, this isn't a wholesome cultural exchange festival that occasionally had some unpleasantness on the side. That unpleasantness was baked into the same infrastructure as the wonder. And here's the thing that genuinely haunts me. Like, a lot of historians think the Black Death, the plague that killed like a third of Europe's population in the 1300s, very plausibly traveled west along the Silk Road trade networks, riding in on fleas, rats, and on the exact same caravans carrying spices and silks and stories. The same roads, the same wells, the same caravansaries where strangers slept shoulder to shoulder, trusting each other with their lives. And I keep turning that over because it wrecks the romantic version of the story in the best possible way. Like, the network that connected humanity also, at its worst moment, nearly unconnected it permanently for a huge portion of people on the western end of that road. The thing that carried perspective also carried death. Same road, same trust, same wells. And see, that's not a footnote. That's the whole complicated truth of what happens when you build a system vast and interconnected. It doesn't get to choose what travels through it. Ideas, disease, art, violence, scripture, plague, it all moves at the same speed through the same gates, whether you wanted it to or not. Now imagine this. Someone in a caravanserai one ordinary night sleeps next to a stranger who's already sick and doesn't know it yet. That's not a villain. That's not a hero. They're just two people sharing a roof because the desert made them. And one of them is about to unknowingly change the fate of a continent. Nobody in that room knew what was happening. That's a terrifying kind of story. Like the one where nobody's the bad guy and the ending is already in motion before anyone notices. And I think that's worth remembering every time we get dreamy about connection as an unqualified good. Connection is neutral. It amplifies whatever you put into it. That was true on a camel route in the 1300s, and it's still true on your phone right now. Alright, so let's get back to the people, because this is where it gets really good. Like, we usually tell history through empires and armies and famous explorers with their names bolded in the textbooks. But I keep getting stuck on a specific group most people have never heard of, called the Sogdians. I could be saying that wrong. I apologize. Anyway, so the Sogdians were from Central Asia, roughly modern-day Uzbekistan. And for centuries, their language became the actual language of the Silk Road commerce. A lingua franca stretching from China to Persia. They weren't a massive empire. They didn't conquer anybody. Their power wasn't military. Their power, oddly enough, was linguistic and relational. Like, they built merchant colonies along the road. Generation after generation, family after family settling in foreign cities specifically to run trade networks. Marrying locally, raising kids who grew up trilingual, functioning as the collective tissue of the entire system. Like, think about what that actually required day to day. A merchant in a Chinese city wasn't just translating words, he was translating etiquette and what jokes landed and which ones would get you killed. He was translating religious sensitivities, business customs, how to be insulted at a lowball offer, how long you're supposed to sit in silence at a negotiation before it's rude. That's an unbelievably high skill, high stakes job. And almost nobody knows their names. And here's the detail that stopped me cold though. Archaeologists found a stash of letters, like actual private letters written in their language over 1600 years old, preserved because the desert is so dry it basically mummifies paper. They're called the Sogdian ancient letters, and one of them is from a woman named Minwei. I could be saying that wrong. Stranded in a Chinese city, writing home, absolutely furious and heartbroken because her husband abandoned her there and she ran out of money and options. Like, think about that context. Like, a stranded woman's actual private angry letter preserved by accident by sand over 1,000 years and now sitting in a museum where anyone can go and read her heartbreak. I mean, I think about her more than I think about most emperors, honestly. Like, she didn't build an empire, she didn't discover anything. She was just a person who trusted a system, trusted a husband, a trade network, a road, and got stranded by it. And had the bad luck of being extremely eloquent about her anger in a letter that happened to survive when almost nothing else did. That's the Silk Road, too. Like, not just silk and spices and monks having spiritual epiphanies. A woman, alone in a city she didn't choose, writing to people who may have never gotten a letter, about being let down by exactly the kind of trust this whole network ran on. And that ordinary letter outlived the empire. We think monuments are about how history survives. Sometimes it's a receipt. Sometimes it's a complaint. Sometimes the thing that makes it into a thousand years into the future isn't the thing anyone intended to preserve. It's just the thing the desert happened to protect. I bet somewhere right now in a landfill or a server farm or a box in someone's attic, there's an equivalent, like a furious text message, a receipt, a grocery list that's going to accidentally survive into some future century and become somebody's Sogdian letter. We have no idea what mundane thing we're making is going to become the artifact. And that should honestly terrify and delight us in equal measure. So let's talk about a caravan guard for a second, because I think we do him a disservice by imagining that he's just muscle. So a caravan guard wasn't only protecting cargo. Think about what was physically in those saddlebags alongside the silk. Religious texts nobody back home had ever seen. Technical knowledge, papermaking techniques, for instance, which historians think may have leaked westward towards the Islamic world and eventually Europe, partially because of prisoners taken during a battle near the Talas River in the 700s. Anyway, these were guys who happened to know how paper was made and ended up teaching it to their captors. Like, think about that chain of events. A battle, a bunch of captured soldiers, and one of the most important information technologies in human history, the ability to mass produce paper, potentially spreads west because POWs who just happen to have a useful skill. Pretty cool. Maybe not their circumstances, but I think it's a pretty cool, interesting story. Like, picture it. A caravan guard, without knowing it, might be walking beside the literal future of written communication in an entirely different civilization tucked into a satchel bag. Like, he thinks he's protecting silk, but in reality, he's protecting an idea that's about to detonate quietly across an entire continent's information system a generation later. And this is the part that gets under my skin. He will never know. He's not going to live to see paper transform how Europe records law, literature, and history. He's just doing a job, watching the horizon, hoping bandits don't show up tonight. See, the people carrying the future rarely get to see it arrive. There's something good and quietly tragic about that little story lens. Like the person guarding something world changing who will die never knowing what they protected. I think about that in terms of every small, unglamorous job that exists right now. Somebody is driving a delivery truck carrying part of something that ends up in a piece of medical equipment that saves somebody's life 3 states away, and they never find out. The scale is different, yes, but the shape of the story is identical, and most of the people carrying the future are anonymous, and they stay anonymous forever. Okay. The actual thing I cannot put down because it's so funny, but it's actually quite interesting if you think about it. So, how many mythical creatures started as someone just badly describing an animal to someone who had never seen it before? I mean, think about it. Like, there's a theory. There's a theory, and it's a theory, not a confirmed fact, so hold it loosely, that ancient reports of gold digging ants the size of foxes, described by Greek historians as guarding treasure in Central Asia, may actually be a garbled description of Himalayan marmots who dig burrows in gold flecked soil and were seen from a distance at a language barrier by people who had never encountered a marmot and had no reference point for a large burrowing rodent. So the description traveled and traveled, and by the time it reached Greece, it wasn't a marmot anymore. It was a giant gold guarding ant. That's not me being cute about it. That's an actual academic theory some historians and etymologists have proposed. And whether or not it's exactly right, the mechanism it describes is completely realistic and probable and provable. Like, distance plus translation plus time equals transformation. Every single time. Same deal with unicorns, probably. Like rhinos, described secondhand by people who'd never seen one, filtered through several rounds of translation and imagination, came out the other end as a horse with a single horn and magical properties. See, no one set out to invent a unicorn. Someone just tried really hard to describe an animal only using words to someone who had never seen it before or ever. And the gaps got filled with imagination because that's what the human brain does with gaps. We don't leave blank spaces blank, we decorate them. And then there's Prester John, one of my favorite rabbit holes in all of medieval history. So, for centuries, European Christians genuinely believed there was a lost Christian king ruling a fabulously wealthy kingdom somewhere out past the Islamic world, in like Asia or Africa, depending on the century. And they searched for him, sent expeditions looking for him, wrote him fictional letters as if he might write back. Historians think this legend probably was stitched together from real, garbled rumors traveling back along routes like the Silk Road. Like actual reports of Christian communities in Asia, actual reports of wealthy kingdoms and powerful rulers, all mashed together over enough retellings that they solidified into one guy. A guy who never existed. He was believed in, searched for, written to for literal centuries, based on rumors. Think about the audacity of that, though. Like, an entire continent organizing actual foreign policy and expeditions around a guy who was basically an oral history typo. And by the time any of these stories traveled 1,000 miles down the road, reality had quietly, invisibly become myth. Like, nobody decided to lie. Nobody sat down and thought, I shall now invent a unicorn. It just happened gradually. The way a photocopy gets blurrier every time you copy the copy. And that feels familiar, right? It's not ancient history. That's Tuesday on the internet. Every retelling changes something. Every screenshot loses context. I heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy strips out one more caveat until what's left barely resembles what actually happened. We think we invented the broken telephone game with game chats and vague TikTok captions, but the Silk Road was running that experiment for 1,000 years before we even had a word for it. It just moved at the speed of a camel instead of Wi-Fi. And I want to push back for a second because I think it's worth being honest about the limits of that comparison. Like, the Silk Road version of the broken telephone game had one thing misinformation modernized mostly doesn't. Time to breathe. See, a rumor traveling by caravan took months, sometimes years, to cross an entire continent. It had time to get challenged, corrected, argued about at a dozen stops along the way by dozens of skeptical people. Modern misinformation can cross the planet in under a second. With zero friction, zero stops, and zero grumpy merchants going, well, that doesn't sound right to me, at a caravanserai halfway through the journey. So, weirdly enough, the old slow version might actually have had more built-in fact-checking than the instant version does now. Slowness was actually a feature back then. That's kind of an uncomfortable thought if you think about it, and I don't have a tidy resolution for it. I just think it's true. See, the moment that keeps replaying in my head isn't a battle or a royal court. It's a caravan finally reaching the end, or an oasis after weeks of crossing empty desert. I want to slow this one all the way down because I don't think I did it justice the first time I told it to myself. So this is my retelling. So picture the actual physical relief of that moment. You've been rationing water for days. Your lips are cracked. Your animals are exhausting or maybe even dying. Every direction you've looked for a week has been the same color. And then green, water, shade, other human beings who aren't the 6 people you've been staring at for a month straight. See, the oasis isn't just a supply stop. It's an emotional decompression chamber. It's the one place on the entire route where the constant low-grade fear of the desert briefly physically, lifts off your shoulders. And people talk more at oases. They gossip more. They ask more questions because for one night, survival isn't consuming every ounce of their attention. Curiosity gets some bandwidth. That's the environment where stories actually happen. Not in the desert where everyone's too depleted to think about anything but the next well. In the oasis. In the pause. That's the environment where the story actually happens. I mean, think about that. Like, someone asks what lies ahead. Another traveler casually replies, well, if you're heading north, don't take X Pass. The last caravan disappeared there. Nobody knows why. Bandits, politics, an avalanche, disease, something stranger nobody wants to say out loud with a fire this low. It almost doesn't matter which one it actually was. Here's what I didn't sit with enough the first time I researched this. Like, notice how casually it's delivered. Not a dramatic warning, but as gossip, as small talk, as the kind of thing you mention between bites of food. The way you tell someone, oh yeah, don't take the 405 after 4. It's a nightmare. Like the banality of the delivery is what makes it terrifying in retrospect. Nobody in that circle around the fire thought they were creating a legend. They thought they were just passing along useful information. Mildly concerning. Kind of the same way you'd warn someone about a pothole. And that's exactly how myths are born. I think, not through dramatic prophecy, but through completely ordinary conversation that later generations retroactively dress up in mystery because the outcome turned out to matter. See, nobody at the fire knew they were the opening line of a legend. They just knew they didn't want another caravan to die. And in that instant, information becomes narrative. A fact becomes a warning becomes a legend, and suddenly the Silk Road stops feeling like a trade route and starts feeling like the birthplace of mythology. Not because anybody tried to make a myth, but because uncertainty plus consequence plus retelling is basically the recipe every single time. Whether you're at an oasis in the 9th century or in a comments section now. And I'm not the first person to notice any of this. And honestly, some of the best proof of that theory is that storytellers keep independently landing on it centuries apart without comparing notes. Like, Marco Polo came home and described what he'd actually seen. Real cities, real courts, real trade networks, and it sounded so unbelievable that the people back in Venice assumed he was exaggerating or outright lying. Like, there's actually a persistent legend that on his deathbed, someone begged him to recant the wilder claims in his book. And he supposedly said something to the effect of, I didn't tell half of what I saw. True or not, I love that as a thesis statement for this entire episode. Reality outran what people are willing to believe. The line between extraordinarily true story and fiction turns out to be thinner than anyone assumes. If the listener has simply never left home. Like Journey to the West, it takes a real historical journey, Shuzong's actual grueling walk to India, and transforms it into a spiritual adventure with a monkey king, demons, and magic. Which tells you something important. Exploration and myth making aren't separate instincts. They're the same. just wearing two different outfits depending on how much time has passed since the trip basically actually happened. And my favorite book ever. Anyway, or collection of stories. Anyway, 1001 Nights basically documents structurally a world where trading stories was as normal and expected as trading spices. Stories nested inside stories, told to survive another night, passed hand to hand across cultures until nobody could say for certain which country a given tale actually started in. That's not incidental to the setting. That's the Silk Road's actual mechanism. Just written down as literature instead of left as a rumor. Even now, we instinctively keep reaching for this shape. Indiana Jones chasing something across the desert was never really about the treasure. It was about the knowledge, the artifact as proof that the impossible was true all along. Uncharted lives entirely in that tension between history says this is forgotten but the myth of it never actually died. It just went quiet. We didn't invent this narrative shape from nothing. We inherited it whole from actual caravan routes and travelers who came home with stories nobody believed. And here's where it stops being a history lesson and starts messing with how I see a Tuesday. See, a road isn't a road. A port isn't a port. An airport isn't just an airport. Any place where people regularly cross paths is a place where stories are quietly mutating in real time. Right now, whether anybody's paying attention or not. Like, think about the modern container part for a second. Like, really think about the way we've been thinking about caravansaries. Thousands of shipping containers moving between countries, packed by workers who will never meet the people unpacking them on the other end. Cargo manifests instead of camel loads. GPS instead of oral memory about which well still has water. It's the same fundamental shape, just running at a completely different speed and scale. Goods moving and quietly, invisibly, ideas, habits, slang, recipes, fears, riding along in those same characters, absorbed by the port cities that handle them, and spreading out from the docks the exact way that they used to spread outward from an oasis. Or think about an international airport terminal at 2 a.m. Different time zones colliding in one overlit room. People from a dozen countries stuck in the same limbo, forced into a kind of temporary proximity that almost nothing else in modern life produces. The gate lounge is a caravanserai. Nobody chose to be stuck there together. But they are, and for a few hours, cultures that would otherwise never touch are sitting 6 feet apart, half asleep, occasionally striking up exactly the kind of conversation that used to happen over a fire 1,000 years ago. See, trade routes never just moved products. They moved fears, religions, art, language, entirely new ways of understanding what's possible. Ports, airports, and international markets and immigrant neighborhoods are doing the exact same thing right now, at this literal moment, whether you know it or not. You've probably just walked through one this week. And I keep wondering, how many of these places are we moving through so fast, so numbly, so routinely that we've stopped noticing they're doing it at all? In this way, speed might actually be working against us. Like, the slower a story travels, the more time it has to become legend. But the faster, well, the more it just becomes noise, content, something to scroll past. Maybe part of what made the Silk Road stories so powerful is exactly the thing that would frustrate us today. They were slow enough to matter. That's an uncomfortable thought for someone living in the instant everything era of today. But I think it's worth sitting with instead of rushing past. See, the Silk Road wasn't simply history's greatest trade network. It was one of the greatest engines of human observation. A machine, if you will, built by nobody in particular out of deserts and greed and faith and desperate curiosity, whose entire byproduct was perspective. It reminds me that creativity rarely appears out of nowhere. It grows whenever different worlds collide. A Sogdan merchant and a Chinese official, a monk and a bandit, a marmot and a Greek historian who's never left his hometown. Originality, maybe, was never about making something out of nothing. Maybe. It's simply what happens when one person notices a connection nobody else has bothered to look at yet, and has the nerve to say it out loud instead of, well, assuming somebody smarter's already thought of it. More than anything, it changes how I walk through my own world. Every train station, every shipping port, every international market, every airport terminal at an ungodly hour. Every neighborhood where 2 or 3 cultures happen to overlap on the same block. They're all quietly running the same ancient machine right now, invisibly, whether anyone's watching or not. Because the Silk Road isn't actually gone. The pavement's changed, the vehicle changed, the speed absolutely changed dramatically, permanently, but people are still out there, right now, carrying pieces of a world into another one, constantly, everywhere, usually without meaning to, usually without ever finding out what happened to the piece they were carrying once they let it go. And somewhere, right now, in a gate, in a port, in a group chat at 1 a.m, in a badly translated post about an animal nobody in the replies has ever actually seen, reality is quietly turning into story. Anyway, that's where my brain's been today. If this made you think, like the video, subscribe if you want more stuff like this. This is WriteSparky, and I will see you in the next video.